Hello, welcome to this edition of the Lexbe eDiscovery webinar series, Finding Holes in Productions. My name is Christian and I'll be introducing our speaker today, but first a little bit of information about the eDiscovery webinar series. The series takes place monthly. We cover a variety of relevant eDiscovery topics, and the presentations will be available on demand for download by registration. A little bit about Lexbe. Lexbe is an Austin, Texas-based eDiscovery software and services provider. We have a mission statement here, and you can see some reviews and endorsements down there at the bottom of the slide. If during the webinar you have any questions or technical issues, please email them to webinars@lexbe.com, and we'll answer them during the webinar or afterwards if we run out of time. About our speaker today, Karsten Weber. He's the Chief Technology Officer of Lexbe. He's the Principal Architect of the Lexbe eDiscovery platform and the Lexbe eDiscovery services. His prior experience includes a consulting expert at the Lumen Expert Group, Director of Software at Enline Corporation, Software Engineering Manager, and he was educated at the University of Texas for MBA and has an MS in Engineering at the Danish Technical University. And with that, I will turn it over to Karsten.
Thank you, Christian. Appreciate that. This month's webinar is about finding holes in production. And basically, I want to talk about, first of all, general plaintiff complaints about productions, where that different ESI sources were missing or hidden, that the calling, the keywords weren't done right, certain documents didn't arrive until after the deposition, and or that you get a complete document dump. There are different ways that plaintiff will complain about the productions, but basically in order to understand these, it's important for the attorneys or the paralegal to understand the IT side of productions. And I want to start out by saying that I'm not a lawyer by background or paralegal. I'm a technologist, and so although I've spent years around lawyers, and some of it might have rubbed off, it's really more of a technical presentation today of how to identify holes in productions. From Craig Ball's presentation, he points out that litigants have been ignoring the eDiscovery obligations with impunity for so long that it has become a form of entitlement. And now the courts are waking to this failure, and they're starting to apply more scrutiny of the productions. Those who have failed to adopt are feeling exposed. So the increased scrutiny, nowadays the receiving party, which is often the plaintiff, can raise doubts about productions. They can, for example, call into question if the right number of plaintiffs were there, the volume of the data, particular types of productions, document sources, and with relatively little effort, they might be able to say that there are questions about a given production. And in the past, judges may have said, well, you just have to go and talk amongst yourself and sort it out. But you'll see more and more that judges are very educated about these points and will take them a lot more seriously now. When that happens, the producing party's time and money will now go into defending the production rather than actually learning about the case and spending more time on preparing for depositions. Also, any problems that have been found to have merits will actually undermine the credibility of the producing party. And then possible sanctions, although those are rare. So how do we demonstrate that there are holes in a production? Well, the first one is very mundane. Basically, look at the Bates numbers. This is very simple, but I think we've still put in a slide on it because even something this simple in certain cases can cause problems. We've seen cases in which we have rolling productions, and so rather than getting all the documents in one lump sum, we're getting them in as much as 50 different batches. And in sometimes these batches will include both the documents produced themselves, but then you have followed by a gap caused by the privilege lock documents, and then followed by the next production, followed by the privilege lock that went along with that. And so in order to determine that there is a gap, you have to look at all the ranges, and you have to know all the privilege logs. In this example, there's a big gap between the first and second row. You will also have overlapping ranges where the documents were first produced as TIFF, and then say later the native versions was supplemented. And so something as simple as just looking at a Bates gap analysis can actually become quite time consuming. And we have seen cases where one of those 50 rolling productions have now been overlooked, or when they went back to the other side and said there's a gap right here, the other side said, oh yeah, we did that production, but we found an error in it, so we redid it, and we didn't reuse that Bates range. So there is a gap, but that's to be expected. So very simple, first order, check the Bates ranges. So what are some of the areas you can examine to prove that there is a gap in a production, or at least raise suspicion of it? It's very rare that you can just look at the number of documents received and say, aha, there's likely a gap here. One possible counterexample would be one where the producing party has sought a 2-month extension, citing just the sheer volume of data that they're dealing with. And then when the production is finally made, 500 to 1,000 documents is all that's produced. That kind of smells like there might be some holes in that production. But even in that case, you'd still have to go through these other methods of examination to determine what it is that's missing. And on a side note, I mean, this is very much within the computer science. It's data mining. So we're mining the data. It's simply gotten so big that you can't just go through by hand and determining that there is a gap. So the first thing that's typically done is look at the number of documents over time. So the data has been received, now broken into time slots, and that's typically done by year and month. And then you look for pattern to see if the variation from month to month is within a statistical expected range. As we'll see, that's later, that's often not enough. You also have to take into account the custodians, and you have to make sure that you're capturing all of those. You also have to look at different data sources. It's not enough to just get emails these days, even though that's often, the holy grail of discovery. You also have to make sure that the file types include Word documents, Excel, any kind of native documents. And in order to perform this data mining, it's really important that we have the metadata to work with. So if metadata has not been requested and not received, some of this is still possible, but it just becomes an order of magnitude more time-consuming and more expensive. And then the point about ESI that's being received by a third party is also, that's a way to look at, I know I've received these documents, I know the party producing it has these same documents, so I would expect to see them in the production. Or you the missing hits from keywords is, say this case is about flat panel TVs, and you search for certain keywords and only 1% or less of the documents come back with these keywords that are really specific to the case. That also raises suspicion. So what can cause this? Certainly a failure to identify all the different repositories. It's, as I said, no longer just email, but you have to have both the local email. They may have a different email that's in the cloud. And you have a local share of the data. So they could have a file server that's shared within the company. They could have files that are just on their laptop. Could have a desktop. Could be on the smart. It could be in the cloud. I mean, all the different sources need to be correctly identified. And this, if nothing else, I mean, this to me is the key takeaway to really make sure that as a lawyer or paralegal, that you fully understand the different repositories and the type of data that should come out from each, and how each of them is backed up, what's the retention policy. Failure to institute a litigation hold plays into that, where certain things may have been backed up and then the backup tapes have been rotated or other files have been deleted. Make sure you get all the sources in the custodian's possession. Poor processing, or OCR, kind of goes back to the point about getting all of the metadata. Without that, you have to OCR the documents, and you're really relying on a good quality of OCR, and that's it's often not good enough in order to do the data mining we're talking about. And then poor keyword search or technology-assisted review. And poor keyword search often evolves around if companies have chosen to do a self-collect and several different custodians are involved, and there's not a strong agreed upon list of keywords, but it becomes much more individually based, you can certainly run into troubles on that. The document date for emails, that comes along with the email, but for all the native files, the date that it was created and the date that it was last modified are really key. If you take certain file types like Office documents or PDFs, then the date created and last modified are stored inside the document itself. And so they actually, as the document gets sent around, that's self-contained. But other files like text files and images, they rely, if you're on the Windows system, for example, they rely completely on the operating system to maintain those fields. And as the files get copied around, if you use the correct tools, that data is easily destroyed. So here's an example of we've got 24,000 plus documents, and they've been broken up to be listed by month. And we see that there is a dip starting in February of 2001. So there is a dip, but the question is that enough to then say that there's a hole in the production, or is this within the statistical range of being normal? And the point is that you can't just look at this as a whole. You really have to have the same graph on a per custodian basis. And here's why. So keep that graph in mind with where there's a dip for those 3 months of, and then assume that that production actually covered 10 custodians. So say there was a 10% drop. This was actually more than 10%, but let's say there was a 10% drop, then that could be a normal fluctuation. But it could also be caused by a 100% drop in a single custodian. So you could have one custodian that just completely dropped out for those 3 months and then came back in, and that could be because it wasn't collected correctly. So that's why you need to see these graphs on a per custodian basis. And then if there's a drop, you can look at, is this just normal business practice? Was the entire company, off on a conference at that point, or was this, in which case that would be normal business variation? Was it all coincide with the beginning of the case? That would be a little bit more suspicious when all the communication drops off. But basically, you need it per custodian. Another example is one where response to interrogatory identifies 12 people that are relevant to the case, but again, this production only covers 10 custodians, and so that would be an easy gap to pounce on as that's a gap in the production. The existing business correspondence is really, one example there would be mergers and acquisitions where the companies have already had an existing business relationship before the case starts. And so you're able to take emails that was sent to defendant, and these emails, who they were sent to, when they were sent, what keywords they contain. You can find documents that are heavily relevant to that case, and then say, I know these documents need to be part of the production. And if you can prove that in this month I sent 50 emails to the other side, but only 2 came back, you can prove that there's a hole that way. And these tasks become much more difficult if there's no metadata. So getting the metadata is really key. There are other cases for review where if you have the TIFF version of a document versus having the native makes little difference, but for these particular tasks, having the natives or having all of the metadata is really key to identifying the holes. So it's finding holes in production. It's a big topic, and we don't have enough time to go into detail on all of them. So I thought I'd just deep dive into one particular section to say how would you perform such an analysis. And for that one, I would say let's look at how you would investigate holes in a production for a particular custodian for a particular time frame. So one of the things that becomes a real challenge is that different email system will have the exact same person listed in different formats. So in this example, let's say we have a company, you have a group message that's sent out to the entire company, and then you would expect, and it's sent from John Smith, you would expect everybody who receives it to have an email that arrives from John Smith, except that's not how it works. If the client, for example, is Outlook, then each person might have set up its own address book, and so it could show up as John Smith for one person, that it came from John Smith, first name, last name, but then somebody else would receive it, and now it's John with the first name, last name, or it might come in as the email, or it might come in as a nickname, Johnny or Hoppy or whatever the case may be. And so you can't just go and say, let's look for J. Smith at Lexbe.com. And then you choose just that one. You search for that, and you search for it for a particular time frame, and you say, aha, there aren't very many of these. They underproduce the John Smith. If you did that, you'd be wrong, because you're failing to identify all the other aliases, if you will, of that same person. And to me, it's very interesting that it really goes to what, if you want to prove, for example, that within this case there's an overrid action. There are all these documents that are 90% black, can't read anything, the privilege log doesn't explain why these documents were redacted. And you just want to show that there are a lot of these examples. You could start sampling, and you could sample the case until you find 20 examples of these, and then you can put together a report, and you can take it in and say, look, we sampled the case, we found these heavily redacted documents, and we don't think that that is reasonable. And you can do that through sampling. This data mining problem of finding out that John Smith has been underproduced is much more difficult, because you're really trying to prove a negative. You're trying to prove that this thing doesn't exist. And in order to do that, you have to go in and find every single different permutation of the name. Basically, the analogy in the medical industry is we have tests that can prove if a certain person has cancer, but we don't have tests that can prove that you don't have it. We just have tests that shows that you didn't register it, but you can't prove you don't have it. This is not quite as hard as that, but it still means that you go in and you go through the metadata. You have to find every single permutation of name, every unique name ever on the sent line, every unique name on the to line, which could be multiple people. Same with the CC and the BCC. So for each email, you could have it mapped to 2 people, it could map to 10 people, it could map to 100 people. So you find all of those unique values, and then now you have to start doing a mapping back to unique ones, so you know John Smith, Smith John, Johnny Hoppy, all maps down to the same custodian. And there are examples where if this thing has gone through processing and we've seen it and we receive it in, say, a TIFF image, it's very possible that it will say this email was sent from Johnny. And then if you go into the metadata, it will say the author of this one is Johnny. There will not be an email address. It's simply not there. It's been processed out, so to speak. And if you have the original, you'll still be able to get back and find out who is Johnny. But without that, you just have to rely on hopefully the name being unique and somewhat your best judgment of getting back to how this mapping is done. But you could have, in an average case, you could have easily 10,000 names, and you need to find the ones that you're looking for here and do the exact mapping. And then once you have that mapping, which is the hard part, then the rest becomes pretty easy of finding the dates and then showing that this drop here is outside of expected range, or there simply isn't anything from a given time period. So the hardest part is really that mapping, and that's where it could. There's a lot of, should we say, pitfalls or traps for the unwary. So this is absolutely something that the attorney or the paralegals could do themselves. And but the very first time around, I recommend doing it with somebody else who's done it before in order to avoid the pitfalls. But then once you've been through it once, you can do it yourself going forward, or you can do it and then have somebody else verify that they can't find any holes in it. So in summary, ESI data, electronic stored information, keeps increasing in size. You can no longer analyze it by hand. You need to apply data mining, and there are pitfalls, as we just talked about. So certainly the first couple of times around, make sure that you align yourself with somebody who's done this before. And then the judges are becoming increasingly educated about the underlying eDiscovery, the IT side of things, and will apply more scrutiny. It's difficult to know if you have a hole in your production. You may not actually see it until it goes out the door. So they're hard to locate, but it's very important to identify, because we've seen examples where the receiving side is able to raise doubt about the production with relatively little effort. They can say, I think this plaintiff wasn't there, I think there was not enough data during the summer of 2012, and with that little effort, they're able to have the producing side spend weeks and weeks of pretty much going through the entire process that was used to do the production and verify that everything is done correctly and there aren't any problems. And then if they now say, okay, we've gone through it all looks good, I mean, you're still able, maybe through prior business relationship, to find it just one email string that proves that no, it's still not complete. And so you can definitely tie up the producing party on spending all that time and effort on productions, not on learning the case and preparing for depositions. And that's all I had for this time. Let's turn it back to Christian.
Thank you, Karsten. That was a great webinar, very informative. Just to wrap up, I have our contact information here. Karsten's email address is karsten@lexbe.com. It's pretty easy. He's put his phone number out there too. And you can contact us at sales@lexbe.com for sales-related questions, and webinars@lexbe.com for the webinar-related questions. Thanks for attending, and everybody have a great day.